presentation of the activities at the Risk and Crisis Research Center and the Åre Risk Event this year. Now I will give you a short overview of the program for today and then also introduce our first speaker. My name is Christine Grosse and I'm interested in critical infrastructure protection and governance, as well as the interconnected risk communication and information security issues. And today, the 3 sessions address the risk theme. First, we learn more about systemic risks and communication and governance strategies. And then we will extend our knowledge about hybrid warfare. And finally, we will listen to several short reflections on risks in different contexts. But first, I'm very pleased to present our first speaker of today, our honorary Dr. Professor Ortwin Renn. He serves as a full professor for environmental sociology and technology assessment, as dean of the Economic and Social Sciences Department, as a director of the Stuttgart Research Center for Interdisciplinary Risk and Innovation Studies at the University of Stuttgart in Germany. He also serves as an adjunct professor for the integrated risk analysis at the Stavanger University, and is as an affiliate professor for risk governance at the Beijing Normal University. Ortwin Renn is also chair and coordinator of the Copernicus Research Consortium, which is named Systems Integration and Coupling of Energy Systems, as well as the scientific director at the Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies in Potsdam, also Germany. Yeah, and apart from teaching and research in a considerable number of positions around the world in the area of risk governance, political participation, as well as technical and social change towards sustainability, he maintains an impressive record of scientific publications of more than 30 books and 250 articles. So please welcome Ortwin Renn for our first presentation of the day. And please, Ortwin, the stage is yours.
Okay, just a second. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me for this early morning discussion on systemic risks. I feel very honored to be at Mid-Sweden University, and also would like to be thanking again Mid-Sweden University for granting me a special honor of being one of the honorary PhDs here. So in that sense, I feel very much aligned to the university here, and I'm very happy to share some of my thoughts on systemic risks with you. And first, I would like to start with the issue, why is a systemic perspective so crucial? And this is a little primer on system thinking in risk. The first thing is that we now face losses that could lead to a breakdown of a whole system's functionality. And that's something that we also have seen in the past, but it's more frequent and more likely to happen just because things are so much interconnected. That also leads up to the likelihood that failure in one system will infect other systems. And since we are living in the corona crisis right now, we're very familiar with the word infecting, but infection can not only happen with viruses and bacteria, it can also go through interconnected systems, for example, when we have cyber problems. There is thirdly the likelihood of risk cascades within and between systems, and risk cascades mean that something starts in one domain and then it follows up in other domains of risks. So when you think about, for example, the Fukushima accident, it was basically tsunamis. The tsunami was kinetic energy that was leading into the destruction of buildings. Those destruction of buildings also were part of the nuclear power plant in Fukushima. And then we got a new type of risk coming up in terms of radioactive contamination. They're often related to wicked problems. You think about climate change or biodiversity. Those are kind of problems that are not easy to resolve, sometimes even difficult to define them correctly. And lastly, that if we talk about governance, and that was already said in the beginning, it requires something like a systems approach in form of integrated and target-oriented policy packages. So we need both integration, but also we need to be targeted, because otherwise, we are managing everything at the same time, which is definitely not possible. Now, this is a traditional risk perspective that we have been used to for many decades. We have some causes, like why things happening. Then we have a risk, which is something not bad that could happen to things that we value, like our health or buildings or environment. And that has consequences, losses, detriments. So what is happening and what kind of impacts are there? That is, a fairly plausible perspective, but I think it is not sufficient. And so we need, I think, to add a systems perspective to it, which also should be simple, but it should be, let's say, more connected. And there are two major components in the systems perspective on risk. The first one is what we call risk agents or vectors. Those are the carriers of the negative potential of a risk. And as I said before, in systems perspective, they're often interacting. And we have something what we can call risk absorbing system, or the target, where the impacts are being felt. So the risk agents or vectors carry the negative energy or the impact into something that absorbs them and a target, and that target responds. Now, the thing is, we have only a limited amount of risk agents, and that makes it much easier to deal with. So we have three physical agents or vectors. That's energy in all its form, from kinetic energy over fire, over thermal energy, into radioactive or also electromagnetic fields. We have substance or any kind of matter, specifically chemicals, and we have biota, and we're very familiar with that kind of physical risk agent. But we also have social risk agents, and that's interesting. So they're also carriers of problems. The most generic one is information. Then we have money, which is also a carrier of risk. Then we have power, and we could also specify it into violence. Now, the interesting thing about the systemic perspective is, so we know that many of the systemic risks that we face are a combination of different risk agents or their interaction or their cascading effects. So it may be that something turns out to be like a big earthquake, so that's energy. That may run into a factory that has chemical substances. Those substances are released. People are getting poisoned or toxic. The water supply is being interrupted. Then we get bacteria coming into the drinking water. The information about the event is not good. People don't know what to do, so they actually amplify the risk. Powerful actors get their money out of the system, and others are impoverished. And in last but not least, there's social unrest and violence of people that are acting against the government. So you can design scenarios around all of this, and you can start with any of the ones, and then you have all kinds of interactive exchange between these various agents. Then if you look more on the risk absorbing system, so what is the target? Then you are in the domain of vulnerability and resilience. And again, that's very important. So if you are more focused on the risk agents or vectors, you basically are in the domain of risk analysis. Today, we call it probabilistic risk analysis because we're only dealing with probabilistic events. But if we really don't know what the risk agent is or how strong it will be and what the combination of the various risk agents might be, it's good also to focus on the risk absorbing system, because that tells you, is it vulnerable against all kinds of different vectors or is it not? And how can we improve its resilience? So this is a kind of a different way of looking at risk. It's not totally different from the classic one, but it is more related to a more complex situation in which societies face risks today. Now, what are the special properties of systemic risks? And I think it's already fairly obvious for what I said before. First is high complexity and interconnectivity is one of the things that's very important. So all these risks cross domains and they maybe even cross the transboundary with lots of cascading effects. We have stochastic relationships, very often ones what we call second order uncertainty, where it's very difficult to quantify the uncertainty in terms of confidence intervals, but there's a lot of, let's say, uncertainty out there that we cannot really resolve. We may characterize it, but we may not be able to quantify it. Due to the complexity, nonlinearity with often tipping points or tipping areas, which means nothing happens until the threshold is being reached, and then we have a disaster. And that's very difficult for risk communication and management, because people normally act on trial and error. And if they try something and nothing happens, they think that's great, so we can continue doing it. And then they reach the tipping point and then it's all lost. So in that sense, we need a strong anticipation here in order to make things change. I already mentioned cross-sectoral and transboundary cascading effects. They could transbound geographic regions, sectors, political constituencies. All of that happens, and that makes it also very difficult for management, because management normally is limited to geographic areas, normally managed by sector, so each a silo, and by different political entities. And lastly, they very often lead to major ambiguity, so that things can be interpreted differently, and then also in management. And so they are often attenuated because they're so complex, but sometimes also aggravated or amplified. Now, what are the challenges for managing or governing systemic risk? Because that's the major element of your conference today. And the nature of the challenges are first that we have limits in terms of quantifying risk and making very precise cause-effect assessments. Our traditional risk analysis was really trying to define the probability distribution over a set of outcomes. And that was something, if you had enough material, enough data from the past or from experiments, then you could do that. Now with systemic risk, it's extremely difficult because things are interconnected. You don't know all the interconnections. There are a lot of intervening variables that makes it very complex. The second point is, and that's something that I think is important to mention, is traditional risk analysis. Well, you may look at one or two black swans, very unlikely events, but basically you said, we're so unlikely we don't have to bother with them. Now, with very complex risk and systemic risk, that's different, because you don't know which black swan is important. And since there are so many black swans, it's very likely that one is going to happen. And to make it even more precise, you can say that at least 1 million black swans with a probability of 1 over a million. And so in that sense, you have to be prepared for black swans, even not knowing for sure which one will occur. Then we deal with a plurality of knowledge claims and assessment. We have a lot of different disciplines that deal with each of these complex risks. Because we have a lot of uncertainty, there are also a lot of legitimate ways of dealing with them and a lot of different scientific assessments. They also lead to counterintuitive implications, which is difficult for risk communication. And already mentioned that trial and error is not a good learning mode if you have nonlinear systems. We see this now in the corona crisis, that soon as the numbers go a little bit down, people start to say, okay, it's fine, now we can relax again. And then, with exponential growth, it can turn around within days. So trial and error is normally not a good thing. You have to anticipate. And there's a bad record for risk reduction worldwide. Now, If we talk about governance for systemic risks, so what are the kind of key elements that we should take into account? First thing is that if things are getting really complex, we always have a combination of risk agents, which make it difficult to model all the risk agents. So very often it may be better to focus on resilience. That means to overcome vulnerabilities within the potential risk absorbing systems. So to make it more robust, more resilient, regardless what happens. We sometimes call it stress test. Well, we do have to do the stress test in reverse order. We have to start with the vulnerabilities and then assess potential stressors that could have an impact on the vulnerability. So we don't start with the risk agents or the risk causes. We start with the vulnerabilities. We talked about the black swan scenarios. That's a fairly good method because we don't know which black swan will actually occur. We construct a set of very diverse black swan scenarios, maybe one black swan scenarios with several natural events, some with some technological events, some with some political events, and then find out if our risk absorbing system is robust enough to deal with that, to cope with this event, either to really prevent the failure of its functionality or to to get online or operated again within a very short time frame. So that's very important. None of these scenarios may become true, but if our system is able to cope with 5 or 6 very bad black swan scenarios, it's very likely that it will also survive the 7th one that we don't know of. And the last one is what we call morphological permutation. We combine the 7 basic risk agents systematically and develop common mode failure scenarios and multiple cascading variations. So that's something other than the black swan scenarios, which is much more narrative. With morphological permutation, we can do it very systematically and quantitatively and still get some very interesting results. And they could really supplement each other. The one is more the narrative one, the one more the systematic one. Now, all of this happens under new societal context conditions, so that makes it more difficult. We have a lot of post-factual information and fake news rather than fact news. So we're living in a what we call post-experience society. We rely on information by third party. That means that we also are confused about what's right and what's wrong. And that makes it difficult, specifically for complex systems, because things are counterintuitive, as I said before. So we're driven almost by beliefs and feelings. Desirability is also very often a criterion for judging truth, and that's a part of the post-factual society. Sweden, I think we still have a lot of trust in the governance systems. In other countries, it's very different. So specifically also scientific elites, but also technical elites under very strong stress and under pressure. And so we are also living with ambiguity. Very often we're not quite sure what are the good values that we need to enforce. So all of that leads to a situation in which complex risk management for systemic risk is not easy to do. So the context is not only conducive to a very rational approach to this, but also sometimes also a very opposed to, let's say, a very strongly evidence-based approach. So let me come then to my conclusions here. What are the properties of systemic risks? They're highly complex. They have cascading effects that are cross-sectoral and cross-boundary, which means we need much more a risk management style that goes out of the silos and really integrates different domains into the risk management team. We have strongly stochastic relationships between cause and effects, again, something that's difficult to communicate. And it's even more the case for the nonlinear functional relationship with tipping points, because people normally learn by trial and error. Here they have to learn by anticipating the negative impacts that would follow after the tipping points. And that's just imaginary for them in the beginning. And there's a lack of attendance very often to systemic risk by risk managers and regulators, because everything is regulated within a domain. And very often complex systemic risks are small in each domain, but aggregated together, they're very big. for example, cyber risks. For each domain, let's say for energy, for water, for anything, cyber risks are maybe not as such a huge risk. But if you take cyber risks together in all the domains, then it is a very strong systemic risk. So what are the required management strategies for all of this? First, we have to focus on resilience more than on the risk agents, at least when we try to quantify and model. And that means there's a strong focus on the risk absorbing system, on the target, on its vulnerability, on its resilience, on its capability really to also cope with surprise. We have to focus on a variety of unlikely stress scenarios. We call them black swan scenarios that could help us to see how robust our system actually is. We can focus on combinations of different risk agents and corresponding risk cascades. That's a more systematic way of doing it, and it's a very good complement to the stress scenarios. We need to include the societal development, the context variables. That's extremely important because all those risks always occur in a socio-technical or socio-ecological environment in which behavioral aspects, collective behavior, also political culture plays a major role. And lastly, I did not put too much emphasis in this talk about it because that's some of, different topic, which also is one of my favorite topics about stakeholder public involvement. I think it's extremely important, specifically if there is a lot of confusion in the populace, to make sure that we have people integrated into risk management efforts, because that's first how they learn to deal with these complex issues, but also to prepare them for this kind of challenge that's not easy to overcome. And with this, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you very, very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward now to your questions.
Thank you, Ortwin Renn, for this very interesting presentation. And as Hannah already has mentioned, I would like you to encourage to ask questions in the question and answer section or in the chat. I will read them out. And we have one question is, how would you describe the difference between complex and complicated risks?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you very much. A complicated risk is if we have a lot of causal factors that could have an impact on something, but it is able that if we make that complicatedness somehow visible, maybe in terms of a model or something else, then we can really get the whole causal connection. Complex is that we have many often unknown intervening variables between causes and effects that either promote, attenuate, or accelerate various causal relationships, and we have feedback loops, positive and negative. And the result of this is, specifically if you don't know all these intervening variables, then we can build models that we believe somehow represent this complex system, but we all know that it will not be represented in total. And that means very often we can explain something ex post, but it's very difficult to anticipate something ex ante. And the more complex system is, the more likely it is that we may miss something. And it's totally it's not, you cannot do it, on a sheet of paper. So that's something, we have so many intervening variables that it takes large computer programs very often to really get a glimpse of all these interactions. So think about climate change, that's really a complex issue where you can see, you have a lot of intervening variables, the cloud formation, albedo effects, and all different kinds of interactions that we all know of, and they all have positive and negative impacts, and we don't exactly know how much they interfere with the causal relationships between the climate gases and the temperature. And so that is a kind of major issue. So complexity requires a simplification in terms of models, and the models will never represent reality. But they can still be a big, big help, and they're always better than intuition.
Yeah, and this might be some kind of a problem for the public sector, just the complicated and complex models. And another question we see here is, When I see how it means the Netherlands government handles COVID-19, it appears not driven by rational decision making, such as suspending vaccination, accepting the bigger risk of disease over the smaller risk of side effects. So the government seems to aim at catering to public opinion with bad risk outcomes. What can we do?
Yeah, well, that's a big question. Thank you very much, Christine, also the person who had asked it. I mean, that was a part that I mentioned, that we really need to think about the societal context in which all this risk management and risk governance occurs. And very often, you know, if we are in our, you know, academic ivory tower, I'll say it this way, we think about, you know, there are some very rational decision makers, and they you know, use the best available evidence to make their decisions. However, that's not the reality, and it's not that politicians are not rational or something, but they have, of course, to take account of what are the sentiments, what are the attitudes, what are the reactions of people to whom all these actions are being addressed. And of course, you know, in democratic systems, we need democratic legitimization, and that means that, you know, the parliaments have to approve of what's been going on, and there are a whole set of interest groups, lobbying groups, and others that also pay a lot of power and influence into these kinds of systems. Now, there are three things I think what's very important. The first thing is that, and I've seen that partially now in the Corona crisis, that science should be ready and should be willing to get into the arena and say, look, you know, what the decision you make, that's your choice. But if your decision is based on wrong information, then it's our obligation to tell you that. And we are here to tell you, look, you know, if you think that you know, whatever, drinking mouthwash is good for not being infected, forget it. You know, it's not what's going to work. And so there are a lot of other things. The second point is that we make it very clear that it's legitimate to make trade-offs between health issues in terms of infection and other kind of sufferings in terms of economic and social losses. It's not like, you know, we have, this is an absolute number to make sure that the number of, you know, infected people is minimized. That is certainly, you know, a very, very important criterion and principle, but there are other things. I mean, if the economy, for example, really collapses, I mean, millions of people are affected, and it has also major health impacts. We know that life expectancy is highly correlated with unemployment. And so we see it also has health impacts. So it's very important, you know, to see not just, that's again what I mentioned with silo mentality. I mean, a lot of virologists have this silo mentality and saying, okay, if you know, why don't you do this? Why don't you do a total lockdown or whatsoever? But, you know, if all the schools are closed and young kids are in small apartments, specifically in poor families, that also increases tensions at home. It can even go to domestic violence, which really did increase over the last year. So in that sense, yes, it's not easy, but, you know, the thing is, what we should strive for is that these trade-offs are made transparent, public, and are debated. It's not something that's just done, you know, behind black doors. And the third thing I think it's very important is that we get the people that are mostly involved in this, either positively or negatively, somehow included in the decision-making process. And again, in a crisis like a pandemic, you can't build this up from scratch. I mean, it's, you know, you have to act quickly. So these things have to be in place before the crisis comes. So, you know, we have been advocating for a long time something like a risk council here in Germany, which has not been done. In the Netherlands, I think this has been done. So in that sense, you're much further than we are, in which a risk council can come up and have very different types of people in there. And then they can say what it means, the kinds of risk management measures for them, and how to make better trade-offs. So those would be my 3 points that I would like to see. I mean, all, of course, with good risk communication, but that's a lot of good craftsmanship.
Yeah, thank you. I have some more interesting questions here in the question and answer section. So I will put something that is about the simplicity of systems. And the question is there a problem when we simplify the systems into something that is possible to model? Obviously it is. Are there different types of simplification that are more problematic than others? What do you think about it?
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I mean, the issue is, I mean, the best thing we can do is to model complexity. I mean, you could simulate, I mean, all kind of different types of modeling techniques. However, I think sometimes very often to ask yourself, what is the purpose of the model? And I think that's the most crucial question, because if you say the purpose is to really represent reality, we're getting lost in detail. So the thing is, for example, in the Corona crisis, if you say, I want to have a good enough model that tells me what kind of measures are effective and which are not. Now, I don't have to know exactly the numbers there, but I have to know, well, wearing masks, is that effective, is not effective? What is the best distance between people so that they're not getting infected? Of course, there's a probabilistic distribution, but you have to simplify. You say 1.5 meters. Okay, that's it, or 2 meters, or 1 meter, or whatever. So in that sense, yes, it should always be purpose-driven. And the other thing, of course, is if you look, for example, your capacity in hospital beds, we have to quantify it because you only have a number of beds there. So there you have to be much more accurate about, your predictions about if things get worse, how many hospital beds would we need? And it doesn't make any sense to say, oh, we need more or we need many. But we have to have a very good estimate about the hospital beds. So what I would like to say is you have different types of precision that you need for different types of decisions. And one of the things that I thought was difficult in the Corona crisis, also not done well in Germany, was, if you think about what can people do, it's actually very simple. I mean, we set the AHA rule, so keep distance, keep masks, make sure you have all the major hygiene things. But then everybody said, oh, it's much more complex, and and then people got confused, and then they said first they shouldn't wear masks, and then they should not wear masks, and so on. So there was a lot of confusion in there, and I think that's where simplicity is really a benefit if you want to have behavioral advice. Behavioral advice should be simple. 3 rules, 1, 2, 3, it's. And if you make it more complex than it is, then people are getting confused and say, okay, scientists are even not clear about it, so why should I? And this, and then of course consistency, but that's a political issue. But for other purposes, it needs to be fairly precise. And so I think if you model it according to purpose, then that's the best way actually to use scientific models in this domain.
Yes, I will read one more question here, and it is about threats. Threats that can be intentional or accidental. And from a governance perspective, would you want to deal with them differently? Or will we need different kinds of resilience against this different kind of risk?
Yeah, well, thank you again. Yeah, you're absolutely. That's also very, it's not a quite easy to answer question. When I talked about the different scenarios, I mentioned that very often it's good to think about these 7 risk agents and then develop scenarios around these agents. And then you can see that very often stress comes from, let's say, wrong information, or it comes from not enough funds being out there. So this is set as a different type of scenario than if you have an earthquake. And as I said, all these risk agents are very often connected, or we have been used to take them all separately. So we have a natural hazard department, we have a technological risk department. We have a health risk department. But we can see that these things are getting more and more intertwined. In that sense, it's important to see how these risk agents interact. And then, of course, you can see, you know, if those kind of interactions actually are a major cause for vulnerability. So, for example, you can very often can see that that say some kind of natural disaster happens, and the information is wrong, and then, of course, you know, and your system cannot respond to it. Or you have something like, you know, you have a combination of 2 or 3 natural physical forces, and nobody feels accountable for this. I said, oh, you know, I'm for earthquakes, but I'm not for fire, you know, and so on. And you suddenly start to have problems with attribution of responsibilities or of accountabilities. And going through these scenarios help you to define these kinds of issues. And then it's very interesting to see that some of the social risks have, let's say, require different types of management response systems. So very often, well, we want to have more flexibility, we want to have more adaptive capacity, we want to have a learning organization. All of that are buzzwords, I know. Well, we can put them into practice. If you look at the physical agents, it's much more having thick walls and having redundancy and diversity and so on. So, but we need to combine them now. That's an issue. And that's not always easy, because sometimes, yes, you want to be flexible, but you don't want to be too flexible, because then, you know, it's arbitrary. And in that sense, yeah, that is an art and a science in itself, to develop a kind of resilient system that takes care of any of these combinations between the risk agents that I mentioned.
Yeah. Yes, I think we can talk about these things for hours. But we have unfortunately coming to an end. So I put the last question here now. You have talked about black swan scenarios, and that they could be useful in some sense. And the question one put here is, if you have an example, how it was successful or not successfully implemented, and how this could be used in risk communication to foster just societal resilience.
Yeah, well, we did a study for the technical or the Academy of Engineering in Germany on the energy system blackout. So that was the issue was, you know, what could cause a blackout. And then we developed 7 black swan scenarios. And many of them were a combination of the hazards. So we had something where people just didn't accept governmental or the infrastructure. So they were protesting anything like, you know, new windmills or new transmission lines. At the same time, we had, you know, very hot weather, so that, or not very, actually the opposite, bad weather, but no wind. And so there was no renewable energy out there. And we did this combination to see if the energy system is able to cope with that, or do we have a blackout then? And we found out, well, some of these combinations that we came up with resulted in blackouts. And so that was a very important element, specifically some of the cyber risks that we had. And it did have impact. So actually, in terms of cyber risk, there were major changes being made to decentralize some of the cyber controllabilities, to take away some of the access to the internet and so on. So in that sense, these scenarios can help really also to improve the resilience of the system. And we had 7 of these black swan scenarios that we and they were also communicated to the government. So we had a report there, which was, of course, from the Academy of Science, that also gives a little bit of credibility. And then they said, okay, well, we need to do something about it. Some of them were very fine. And we noticed that, you know, we still added a lot of buffer in there. And there's through import and export, we could actually, you know, compensate some of the losses. But others, it was very clear, no, that wouldn't work if that happened. And again, we said, it's this specific scenario might not happen at all. But if it doesn't work with this specific scenario, it might not work with many others too. And I think that was a major kind of argument that we would like to do.
Yes, thank you for answering all the questions, very comprehensive. And I think we need to stop here. And I would like to thank you again for being part of the Åre Risk Event this year. And we really look forward to a future visit at the RCR and the Mid-Sweden University. I hope this will be possible somehow in the future.
Well, thank you very much also, Christine, for very good moderation. And if any of you have further questions, you can really address them to me via email. I'm very happy to answer them to you. So I know there's always more than we have time to discuss them, and sorry that I cannot be with you for the rest of this conference. My problem is also I don't speak Swedish, which of course I should learn if I have this honorary degree, but it's a little late for me probably to learn another language. Nevertheless, I really appreciate being here, and if you have any question, don't hesitate to send it to me via email.
Thank you for today, and I will try to switch to Swedish now. Hanna, om du vill dela sista bilden så kan jag gå vidare med det. Den här presentationen har blivit på engelska, men nu är resten av dagens program på svenska. Och om en kort stund så börjar vi med en ny Zoom-rum där vi pratar om hybridkrigföring och vad det är för någonting. Där Håkan Gunnar Iosson upplyser oss mer om den delen. Länken och vidare program och mer information finns på www.mio.se. Åre Risk Event som står längst ner här på sidan. Och som vi sa, hela veckan blir det mer om både risk, kris, hållbarhet och även själva labbet vi har i Östersund. Så det kommer att bli väldigt spännande. Och nu tänker jag ni får ha en bensträckare och så syns vi om en stund i nästa Zoom-rum. Tack för idag. Eller för nu.